Trevon Kane had always believed that home was a place where you could breathe freely, where the world outside couldn't reach you unless you let it in. His house wasn't extravagant, just a solid, well-built structure at the end of a quiet street, surrounded by a decently sized yard and a driveway wide enough to fit both his car and the occasional visitors. He had bought it with the idea of long-term stability, a place to retreat after long days managing his gym, a business he had built from the ground up with sheer persistence. The neighborhood wasn't particularly close-knit, but it was predictable, and predictability was something Trevon valued. At least that's how things had been before the morning he stepped outside, coffee in one hand, gym bag in the other, only to stop short at the sight of a towering metal fence cutting directly across his driveway. For a long moment he just stood there, staring, unable to process what he was looking at. The fence was solid, not some makeshift barrier but an actual construction, complete with thick metal posts dug deep into the asphalt. A heavy-duty chain wrapped around the middle, locked with a commercial-grade padlock, as if someone expected him to try and rip it down with his bare hands. He stepped closer, setting his coffee down on the hood of his car as he ran his fingers along the metal. Cold. Unyielding. This wasn't a prank. Someone had put real effort into this. His first thought was that it had to be some kind of mistake, maybe city workers had put it up for road work or some utility issue. But why his driveway? He turned his head, scanning the street, but everything else was as it had always been. The neighbors' houses stood unchanged, their cars parked neatly in their respective driveways. There was no sign of construction, no warning signs, no explanation. Then, from the corner of his eye, he caught movement. A figure standing just past the fence, arms crossed over his chest, watching. Trevon turned fully, his jaw tightening as recognition settled in. Douglas Reynolds. The neighbor from 2 doors down, the one Trevon had barely spoken to in the 2 years he had lived here. He was in his 60s, broad-shouldered but slightly hunched, with a weathered face that always carried an expression of faint disapproval. Most of their previous interactions had been limited to nothing more than a nod in passing, maybe the occasional gruff acknowledgement if they happened to take out the trash at the same time. Yet here he was now, standing on the other side of this newly erected barricade, watching Trevon with an expression that was impossible to read. Trevon exhaled slowly, forcing his voice to stay level. "Doug, what the hell is this?" He gestured at the fence. "Why is this here?" Douglas didn't answer immediately. He just tilted his head slightly, as if considering his words, then finally spoke. "You're trespassing." Trevon blinked. "What?" "This is my property," Douglas continued, his voice calm, almost detached. "This driveway. Been mine for years. You've been using it without permission." For a second, Trevon actually thought the old man was joking. But there was nothing in his expression to suggest humor. "Doug, this is my driveway. My car is parked here. I've been living here for 2 years, and there's never been a problem." Douglas gave a slow shrug. "You assumed it was yours. But assumptions don't mean anything, son. I had a survey done. This part of the land belongs to me." Trevon narrowed his eyes. "Bullshit." "Believe what you want," Douglas said, turning slightly as if he was already done with the conversation. "The fence stays." Trevon felt his pulse tick up a notch, heat creeping up his neck. He wasn't the type to lose his temper easily, but there was something about the way Douglas spoke so casual, so matter-of-fact that made his fingers itch to grab something and throw it. Instead, he forced himself to breathe, to think. "Fine. If you actually believe this is legal, show me the paperwork. Because I know for a fact that my deed includes this driveway." Douglas didn't even look back at him. "You'll figure it out soon enough," and with that, he walked away, disappearing behind his house, leaving Trevon standing there, fists clenched, staring at the fence like it was a living thing that had just challenged him to a fight. The rational part of him knew what he had to do. He needed to check his documents, pull up every legal record tied to his property, and get a lawyer involved if necessary. But the immediate, visceral reaction clawing at his chest was the raw, undeniable need to tear the damn thing down himself. He ran a hand over his face, inhaled sharply, and forced himself to step back. Losing his temper wouldn't solve anything. He needed answers, and he needed them now. Turning on his heel, he marched back inside, heading straight for the office where he kept his paperwork. He found the folder containing his property records, flipping through pages until he found the survey map that had come with the purchase. His finger traced the lines, the clear demarcation of his land. His driveway was well within his boundary. There was no question about it. So what the hell was Douglas talking about? Frowning, he grabbed his phone and dialed the real estate agent who had handled his purchase. It took a few rings before a familiar voice answered. "Hey, Trevon. Long time no talk." "Everything okay?" "No," Trevon said flatly. "I need to ask you something. When I bought this house, was there ever any dispute about the property lines?" There was a pause. "Not that I recall. Everything was standard." "Why?" "Because my neighbor just put up a damn fence across my driveway and is claiming it's his land." Silence on the other end. "Then, that's odd. Have you checked the county records? Sometimes there are old easements or boundary adjustments that don't show up on standard surveys." Trevon ground his teeth. "How do I do that?" "I can pull the files for you, but you might want to go down to the records office yourself if you need something fast. If there's anything weird, they'll have it on file." Trevon nodded, already grabbing his keys before remembering that his car was trapped. "Great. I'll figure something out." "Hey, Trevon." "What?" A brief hesitation. "Be careful. Property disputes can get messy." Trevon exhaled through his nose. "Yeah, I'm starting to see that." He hung up, his mind already racing ahead. There was no way in hell Douglas was right about this. Whatever he thought he had, whatever document he was clinging to, it had to be wrong. And if it wasn't, then Douglas had planned this. And that was a whole different problem. Trevon didn't waste any time. The moment he hung up the phone, he grabbed his backpack, stuffed his property documents inside, and stepped out onto his porch. His car was still trapped behind the fence, which meant he'd have to walk to the county records office or call for a ride. Neither option sat well with him. He hated relying on anyone, and the idea of leaving his house unattended while Douglas was up to something made his stomach twist. But sitting here fuming wouldn't fix anything, so he locked up and started down the street on foot, his pace brisk, his mind racing. The morning air was cool, crisp in a way that usually cleared his head, but today it only made him feel more wired, more on edge. He ran through every possible explanation for what was happening, but none of them made sense. Douglas had lived here longer, sure, but if there had been a legitimate property dispute, why was this the first he was hearing about it? Why hadn't the previous owner mentioned anything? More importantly, why the hell had Douglas gone straight to building a fence instead of talking to him first? It took him almost 30 minutes to reach the records office, his frustration mounting with every step. By the time he pushed through the glass doors, he was already bracing himself for more bureaucratic nonsense, but he wasn't expecting the tension that settled in his chest the moment he stepped inside. The place was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that made him feel like he was walking into something he wasn't supposed to see. A woman behind the counter glanced up, offering a polite but distant smile. "Help you with something?" "Yeah," Trevon said, adjusting his bag. "I need property records for my address. Current and any past ownership history, boundary surveys, anything you've got." She nodded, typing something into her computer. "What's the address?" He gave it to her, shifting his weight as she scrolled through the database. The seconds stretched, and his impatience grew. He could practically feel Douglas smirking from 2 blocks away. Finally, the woman frowned, tilting her head slightly. "That's strange." Trevon's stomach tightened. "What?" "There's a file here, but it looks like something was updated recently." "How recently?" She clicked again, her brow furrowing. "A few months ago. Boundary adjustment." But she hesitated. "It doesn't look like it was properly processed. There's a note here that says pending review but no finalization." Trevon clenched his jaw. "So does that mean it's valid or not?" "Technically, no," she said carefully. "If it wasn't approved, it shouldn't be enforceable. But if someone pulled this paperwork and didn't check the status, they might think it's legitimate." His pulse hammered against his temples. "Can I get a copy of that?" She nodded, printing out a set of documents and sliding them across the counter. He skimmed through them quickly, his eyes catching on a name in the recent adjustments section: Douglas Reynolds. Of course. Trevon forced a breath through his nose, gripping the papers tightly. And what if someone hypothetically used this as justification to block off part of my property? The woman hesitated. You'd need to dispute it legally. If it's still pending, you might be able to get it thrown out quickly, but if they push back, it could take a while. Great, Trevon muttered. Thanks. He left the office moving faster than before, his mind buzzing. So Douglas had filed for a boundary adjustment. It hadn't even gone through, but he had acted like it was a done deal. That meant one of two things: either he was an idiot who didn't bother to check, or he knew exactly what he was doing and was betting that Trevon wouldn't fight back hard enough to stop him. Either way, the fence wasn't legal, and that was all the leverage Trevon needed. By the time he made it back to his house, he was already planning his next move. He was going to confront Douglas, not with anger, not with threats, but with facts. He'd shove these papers in his face and make it clear that whatever he thought he was doing, it wasn't going to work. But when he turned the corner onto his street, he stopped dead in his tracks. Douglas was in his yard. Not just standing there, he was digging. Trevon's heartbeat kicked up, a strange sense of unease creeping up his spine. The old man was about 20 feet from the fence, shoveling out a deep, precise hole in Trevon's yard like he had every right to be there. A pile of freshly turned dirt sat beside him, and something about the way he moved, calm, deliberate, unhurried, sent a chill through Trevon's bones. "What the hell are you doing?" Trevon called, striding up to the fence. Douglas barely glanced up. Prepping. For what? Douglas finally met his gaze, his expression unreadable. For what's coming. Trevon's grip tightened on the documents. "You've got 1 minute to get off my property before I call the cops." Douglas gave a slow, deliberate shrug, tossing another shovel full of dirt aside. "Go ahead." Something about the way he said it made Trevon hesitate. Douglas wasn't acting like someone who was worried about consequences. He was acting like someone who knew there wouldn't be any. Trevon exhaled sharply and turned toward his front door. If Douglas wanted to play games, fine. He had the paperwork. He had proof. And if Douglas was betting that he'd just roll over and accept this, he was in for one hell of a surprise. But when Trevon reached his porch, something else stopped him cold. A dead bird lay on the welcome mat, its wings splayed unnaturally, its neck twisted at an angle that wasn't natural. His hands curled into fists. He looked back at Douglas, but the old man was already walking away, shovel in hand, disappearing into his house without another word. Trevon stood there for a long moment, staring down at the bird, listening to the silence of the street around him. This wasn't about property anymore. This was something else. Trevon stood on his porch, staring at the lifeless bird at his feet. A normal person might have chalked it up to a stray animal or a freak accident, but after everything that had happened, he wasn't that naive. The unnatural angle of its neck, the way it had been placed directly on his welcome mat, it was deliberate. A message. His stomach churned, but he refused to let the unease settle. He had bigger things to deal with than Douglas' twisted mind games. He stepped over the bird, making a mental note to clean it up later, and walked back toward the fence. Douglas had disappeared into his house, the front door shut like nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just been digging up Trevon's yard like he owned the place. Trevon clenched the papers from the records office in his hand and rattled the fence. "Douglas, get out here." No response. No movement from behind the curtains. Trevon exhaled sharply. He wanted to tear the whole damn thing down with his bare hands, but that's what Douglas wanted, for him to lose control. Instead, he pulled out his phone and took more pictures. The fence, the chain, the lock, the fresh dirt pile, the spot where Douglas had been digging. Evidence. Then, without another word, he turned and walked down the street toward the only other person who might know what was going on. Douglas wasn't the only longtime resident on this block. The house next door belonged to Eleanor Parker, a woman in her late 70s who had lived here since the neighborhood was first built. She was sharp, observant, and had a way of knowing everything about everyone. If Douglas had been pulling something like this for a while, she would know. Trevon knocked twice, and after a few moments, the door cracked open. Eleanor peered out, her expression cautious until she recognized him. Trevon, she said, voice warm but tired. What's wrong? He didn't waste time. Douglas put up a fence across my driveway. Her eyes darkened. I know, that threw him. You know, she sighed, opening the door wider and gesturing for him to step inside. The house smelled like old books and lavender, a sharp contrast to the cold pit forming in his stomach. I saw them putting it up 2 nights ago, she admitted, leading him toward the kitchen. Didn't think it was legal, but, well, Douglas has his ways. Trevon frowned. What the hell does that mean? She hesitated, stirring a spoon absent-mindedly in her tea. It means that you're not the first person he's done something like this to. That stopped him cold. What? Eleanor set her cup down. The people who lived in your house before you, Roger and Linda Cook, they left because of him. He made their life hell. Trevon's fingers tightened around his phone. How? Eleanor sighed. It started small. First he'd complain about their dog barking except they didn't have a dog. Then, things started going missing from their yard. Lights shattered. Tires slashed. They never caught him doing anything, but they knew. And then, one morning, they woke up to a trench dug across their driveway. Trevon's skin prickled. A trench, 6 feet deep, Eleanor said, filled it with water. Told them it was a drainage issue. They tried fighting it, but the county records mysteriously changed, and suddenly Douglas had paperwork saying it was his land. Roger was ready to take it to court, but then one night she stopped, looked at him carefully. Trevon leaned forward. What happened? She exhaled. Someone broke into their house while they were sleeping, didn't take anything, just moved things, turned every picture frame upside down, rearranged the kitchen chairs. Roger found muddy footprints leading from the back door to their bedroom. Trevon's stomach twisted. They left a week later, Eleanor finished. Didn't even try to sell the house properly. Just packed up and left. No forwarding address. Trevon ran a hand over his face. Jesus Christ. She gave him a knowing look. I'm guessing he's already started with you. Trevon thought about the bird on the mat. The way Douglas had been digging in his yard. The way he acted like none of this would ever come back on him. He nodded. Eleanor sighed. Then you need to be careful. You push too hard, and Douglas will push back in ways you won't expect. Trevon clenched his jaw. He refused to be another person run out of this neighborhood by a lunatic. Do you have security cameras? She asked. Trevon shook his head. He had never needed them before. You should get some, Eleanor said, and watch your house at night. Trevon nodded, his mind already working through the next steps. Thanks, Eleanor. She gave him a look that was half sympathy, half warning. Don't do anything stupid. Trevon left, his pulse pounding in his ears. If Douglas thought he was going to roll over and let this happen, he was dead wrong. When he got home, the dead bird was gone, not blown away by the wind. Gone. His mat was clean. No blood, no feathers, like it had never been there. Trevon stood on his porch, muscles tense. Douglas was watching him. Fine. Trevon wasn't going to let him play this game alone. He bought the cameras that night. Set them up himself. One at the front door. One facing the driveway, and one hidden in the bushes across from Douglas' house. If Douglas wanted to escalate this, Trevon was going to be ready. The cameras were in place before midnight. Trevon didn't waste time fumbling with complicated setups. He chose models that were easy to install but reliable, the kind that could record in complete darkness and send alerts straight to his phone. He mounted one near his porch, another high on the garage, and a third, his most important, hidden within the bushes facing Douglas' house. He wasn't just watching his own property now. He was watching Douglas. When the system went live, he sat at his kitchen table, eyes locked on the feed displayed on his phone. The grainy black and white image of his driveway stared back at him. The fence was still there, the chain and lock glinting under the porch light. Nothing moved. No sounds except the faint hum of his refrigerator. He should have been exhausted, but his mind refused to shut down. The dead bird. The digging. The missing mat. It all churned in his gut like a warning he couldn't quite decipher. Eleanor's words haunted him. They left a week later. No forwarding address. He wouldn't be next. At 3:17 a.m., his phone buzzed. Motion detected. His breath caught as he tapped the notification. The camera feed flickered. For a moment, all he saw was the empty driveway. Then, from the left side of the frame, a shadow moved. Trevon's pulse spiked. Douglas. The old man stepped into view, moving slowly, deliberately barefoot. He wasn't carrying tools or another shovel. Just his hands at his sides, his posture unnervingly relaxed. He walked to the fence, rested a palm on the cold metal, and stood there, motionless, staring at Trevon's house. Then he smiled. Trevon swallowed. His grip on the phone tightened, but he didn't move, didn't make a sound. The camera had no audio, but he could imagine the faint rasp of Douglas breathing, the dry crackle of his joints as he shifted. The man didn't blink, didn't fidget. He just watched. Then, slowly, he turned his head straight toward the hidden camera. Trevon froze. Douglas' smile widened, and without breaking eye contact, he raised a single finger to his lips. A shiver ran down Trevon's spine. And then just as slowly as he had arrived, Douglas stepped back, turned, and disappeared into the darkness. Trevon's skin crawled. It wasn't just the fact that Douglas had been outside at this hour. It wasn't even the fact that he had found the hidden camera. It was the message. The silent warning. I see you, but you can't see everything. He replayed the footage 3 times. He didn't imagine it. Douglas had known exactly what he was doing. Trevon didn't sleep. By morning, the tension in his body had coiled so tight he felt like a live wire. He needed to do something. Letting Douglas keep the upper hand wasn't an option. He grabbed his paperwork, the deed, the original survey, the copy of the pending review, the boundary adjustment, and drove straight to the county office. He had to get ahead of this. The clerk behind the counter was different this time. A younger guy, distracted and half bored as he tapped at his keyboard. When Trevon handed him the documents and explained the situation, the man barely raised an eyebrow. The adjustment's still listed as pending, he said, scrolling through the records. Looks like it was never finalized. I know, Trevon said, but my neighbor is acting like it's legitimate. He's built a fence. He's trespassing. The clerk frowned. That's odd. If it wasn't approved, he shouldn't have the authority to do anything. No shit, Trevon muttered. Can I file something to stop him? The clerk hesitated. Well, technically you'd have to go through a legal dispute. But hold on, he clicked something, eyes narrowing. That's weird. Trevon leaned forward. What? There's a note here that says a request was submitted to accelerate the review process. Trevon's stomach dropped. By who? The man scanned the screen. It doesn't say. Just a system log from a few days ago. Trevon's fingers curled into fists. Douglas was trying to force the county's hand. Push this through before Trevon had time to fight it. How long until they make a decision? The clerk shook his head. No way to know. Could be a few weeks, could be tomorrow. Trevon exhaled sharply. And if they do approve it, then he technically has a claim. Trevon's jaw tightened. That couldn't happen. He left the office with a storm raging in his head. Douglas was playing this from every angle, physical, psychological, legal. He was trying to squeeze Trevon out the same way he had done to the previous owners. But this time he had picked the wrong person. When Trevon pulled into his street, something immediately felt off. He slowed the car, scanning his property. The fence was still there. The house looked the same. But then he noticed his trash cans. They had been dragged into the middle of his driveway, not tipped over, not scattered, just placed there, precisely, deliberately. His chest tightened. He parked, got out, and moved them aside, his entire body humming with tension. His skin felt electric, like he was being watched. Then he saw it. His front door was open. Not wide, just an inch. A barely noticeable sliver of darkness between the frame and the wood. But he had locked it. Trevon's pulse pounded. Every instinct told him don't go inside. But his feet were already moving. He pushed the door open slowly. The house was silent. Nothing looked disturbed, no broken glass, no signs of forced entry. But something felt wrong. He stepped inside. listened. The air was still, thick with something unseen. And then he saw it. Every cabinet door in the kitchen was wide open. The drawers, too, not ransacked. Not messy, just open. Exposed, like someone had gone through them carefully, methodically, and left everything as it was. His hands curled into fists. "Douglas," he whispered. He checked the cameras. Nothing. No footage of anyone entering. But Douglas had been here. He wanted Trevon to know he had been here. Trevon took a slow breath. His hands trembled not with fear, but with something darker. Enough. Douglas wanted him gone. Wanted to make him question his own space, his own safety. But Trevon wasn't going anywhere. This wasn't a game anymore. It was a war. Trevon locked the door behind him, double-checking the deadbolt, even though he knew it wouldn't matter. Douglas had been inside once, and if he wanted to do it again, he would. The man was too brazen, too sure of himself. It wasn't about breaking in to steal. It was about control. About showing Trevon that no matter how many locks he installed or how many cameras he set up, Douglas would always be one step ahead. The thought made his skin crawl, but it also sent a surge of cold, burning anger through him. He wasn't just going to sit back and wait for whatever was coming next. He spent the next hour going through every room, checking every corner. Nothing was missing. Nothing was broken. Just the cabinets left open, a silent violation of his space. It was almost worse than a break-in. A break-in was about taking. This was about being seen, about showing him you can't stop me. When he finally sat down, his mind was already calculating his next move. The legal angle was too slow. If the county approved Douglas' request before Trevon could counter it, then fighting it would turn into a long, drawn-out court battle. And Douglas knew that. That's why he was trying to push him out before it got to that point. But this wasn't just about legal paperwork anymore. The man was playing dirty, and Trevon was done letting him dictate the rules. The next morning, he made his first move. He drove to a security company on the other side of town, one that specialized in reinforced locks, motion sensors, and silent alarms. He paid for next-day installation. The guy behind the counter raised an eyebrow at the rush request, but Trevon didn't explain. He didn't need to. By sunset, his house was fully rigged. Every entry point secured. Every window alarmed. If Douglas so much as breathed near his property again, Trevon would know. But Douglas wasn't done either. That night, Trevon lay awake, listening. His heart pounded in his chest, his senses on high alert. Every creak in the house made his muscles tense, but the real signal came just after 3 a.m. The security system pinged his phone. Motion detected. Front yard. Trevon sat up so fast his vision blurred. He grabbed his phone, pulled up the feed, and there he was. Douglas. But this time, he wasn't standing by the fence. He wasn't smiling at the camera. He was digging again, right in the same spot as before. Trevon clenched his jaw so hard it hurt. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed his jacket, shoved his feet into his boots, and walked straight out the front door. Douglas didn't stop. Didn't even look up. The only sound was the steady scrape of the shovel biting into the dirt. Trevon stepped closer, fists tight at his sides. "Stop," he said, his voice low, controlled. Douglas kept digging. Trevon took another step forward. I said, "Stop." Finally, Douglas paused. He lifted his head, sweat glistening on his forehead despite the cool night air. His face was calm, too calm. "You shouldn't be out here," Douglas said. "Not this late." Trevon exhaled through his nose. "You are on my property digging a hole in my yard. You don't get to tell me where I should be." Douglas leaned on his shovel. "Your property." Trevon's fingers twitched. "Yes." Douglas smiled, slow and knowing. Not for long. The rage that had been simmering inside Trevon for days nearly snapped. He took another step forward, his voice sharp. "Get out. Now." Douglas didn't move. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, tilting his head slightly. "This place isn't yours. It was never yours. And you can fight all you want, but in the end you'll leave just like the others." Trevon's breath hitched. The others. Douglas' smile widened, and for the first time, Trevon saw something in his eyes that sent a ripple of unease through him. Not amusement, satisfaction. Then, as if dismissing the conversation entirely, Douglas dropped the shovel. It landed with a dull thud, half buried in the dirt. Then he turned and walked away. Trevon didn't move, his heart pounding in his ears, the way Douglas said it. The others. His mind went back to Eleanor's warning. Roger and Linda Cook. The last people who had lived here. They left suddenly. They ran. And now Douglas was acting like this was inevitable. Trevon took a shaky breath, forcing himself to step closer to the hole. He needed to know. The dirt was loose, freshly turned. He crouched, ignoring the chill that crawled up his spine, and reached in. His fingers brushed against something solid, not a rock, something smoother, metal. His pulse spiked. He dug deeper, pulling at the object, and it came loose with a soft, wet sound. He lifted it into the light. A rusted padlock. Trevon stared at it, confused, until he noticed the engraving. A set of initials. R.C. A sharp chill ran through him. Roger Cook. His stomach twisted. He let go of the padlock, his breath suddenly too shallow. He didn't know what was buried here. Didn't know how far this went. But one thing was clear: Douglas wasn't just messing with him. Douglas was erasing people. Trevon felt a sharp pull in his gut, a sensation that told him something had already shifted beyond his control. His breathing was steady, but his pulse hammered against his ribs as he stood there, the weight of the silence pressing down on him. The knocking had stopped, but the words still lingered in the air, hanging there like a phantom breath against the back of his neck. You shouldn't be here. The voice had been low, deliberate, too close. He didn't move right away. His body wanted to react, wanted to grab the nearest weapon, tear through the house, do something. But he forced himself to think. He had checked every door, every window before coming inside. The system had been armed. No entry points breached. And yet, the cameras had gone dark, and now there was a voice inside his home. He took a slow, careful breath. If Douglas was in here, if he was trying to corner him, then Trevon wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of panicking. He reached for the nearest kitchen drawer and pulled out a heavy-duty utility knife. It wasn't a gun, but it was sharp enough to put a hole in someone if they got too close. His grip was steady as he moved through the house, slow, controlled steps, eyes scanning every shadow. The air felt thick, charged with something just beneath the surface, something crawling beneath his skin. He stepped into the hallway, his back to the wall, listening. The house felt different. It wasn't just about an intruder. It was the unsettling realization that his own home, the space he had built for himself, no longer belonged to him. A faint noise from the back of the house made him stop. Not movement breathing. He exhaled through his nose, shifted his weight, then moved toward the sound. Every instinct told him to be ready, to expect Douglas waiting in the dark, some smug expression on his face, playing his twisted game. But when Trevon stepped into the doorway of his bedroom, knife raised, the room was empty. Except for one thing. The box. The same box he had dug up from the yard. The one he had left in the living room. Now it was on his bed. Open. Trevon's skin prickled. He hadn't touched it since coming inside. He hadn't brought it here. His jaw tightened, and he took a slow step closer. The photographs were gone. In their place, at the very bottom of the box, was something else. Something small. Something new. A key. Not rusted. Not old. New. Polished metal catching the dim light. Trevon reached for it, but just before his fingers touched it, his phone buzzed in his pocket. The vibration sent a jolt through his spine. He pulled it out, expecting another motion alert. But it wasn't from the cameras. It was a text message. From an unknown number. Check the door. A chill rolled down his back, but his legs were already moving before he could think. He turned and strode back toward the front of the house, gripping the knife tighter. The entryway was just as he had left it. No signs of forced entry. No sounds beyond his own breathing. But then he saw it. The deadbolt. Unlocked. His stomach dropped. He knew with absolute certainty that he had locked it when he came in. He knew it. His breath came slower now, his mind running through every possibility, every angle. If Douglas had been inside, he was gone now. No footsteps, no motion alerts, just a lingering presence, something heavier than fear, something that felt like inevitability. Trevon turned back to the bedroom, back to the key sitting in the box. It wasn't just an object. It was an invitation. And whatever door it belonged to, Douglas wanted him to open it. Trevon stared at the key resting inside the box, its polished surface gleaming under the dim light. He didn't want to touch it. Every part of him screamed that this was a trap, a carefully placed piece in whatever game Douglas had been playing. But walking away wasn't an option. Not anymore. His house had already been invaded, his sense of security ripped away. Ignoring it wouldn't change that. So he reached down, his fingers closing around the cold metal. The second he lifted it, something shifted. A sound so faint he almost didn't hear it, a click, like a lock sliding into place. He turned sharply, scanning the room, his breath steady despite the pulse hammering in his ears. Nothing had changed, but something felt different. He checked the windows, still locked. The hallway empty. He turned the key over in his palm, studying it. No markings, just an ordinary house key. Except it wasn't his. He stepped out of the bedroom, his grip tightening as he moved through the house, checking every door. Front, back, garage. He tested them all. None matched the key. His stomach twisted. If it didn't belong to his house, then his eyes flicked toward the front window. Douglas' house. It hit him all at once. Douglas hadn't just broken in to intimidate him. He had given him something. An opening. A challenge. Trevon had spent days reacting, waiting for Douglas' next move. But this was different. A sharp gust of wind rattled the porch railing outside, and before he could second-guess himself, he was already moving. The world outside felt still, unnervingly quiet. The street was empty, the air thick with something he couldn't name. His feet carried him forward, past the fence, toward the house next door. Douglas' porch light was off, his curtains drawn. But Trevon knew he was watching. He always was. He stepped onto the wooden planks, the boards groaning beneath his weight, and reached for the door handle. It turned too easily. Unlocked. His pulse quickened. He slid the key into the lock, half expecting it not to fit. It turned perfectly. The door creaked open. The house smelled like dust, stale air, something faintly metallic beneath it all. The living room was dimly lit by the glow of a single lamp, casting long shadows across the walls. Furniture sat neatly in place, nothing disturbed. No signs of struggle. No mess. Just stillness. Trevon took a slow step inside. The floorboards didn't creak. It was as if the house was holding its breath. He moved further in, his senses on high alert. The walls were lined with shelves, books stacked in careful rows. A clock ticked somewhere in the distance. The kitchen was spotless, every dish in place, the countertops gleaming. It looked lived in, but not recently, like a perfectly staged replica of someone's home. Then he saw it. A door at the end of the hallway, slightly ajar. Something shifted in his chest. A deep, instinctual warning. Leave. But he had come too far to turn back now. He moved toward it, his breath steady, his grip tightening around the key. He pushed the door open. The basement stairs stretched downward, swallowed by darkness. A faint hum drifted up from below, like an old appliance running somewhere deep inside. He exhaled slowly, his heartbeat a steady drum in his ears. He took the first step. Then another. The wood felt solid beneath his feet, but the air grew heavier the further he went. The light at the bottom flickered. Then he saw them, boxes. Dozens of them. Lined up neatly along the walls, labeled in thick black ink. Some names he recognized. Roger Cook. Linda Cook. Others were unfamiliar. Names of people he had never met. But they all had something in common. They were all previous owners of his house. His throat tightened. He stepped closer, reaching for the nearest box, his hands cold as he lifted the lid. Inside, carefully arranged, were personal belongings, photographs, old keys, faded documents, pieces of lives erased. A sharp creak from the stairs made him freeze. He turned slowly. Douglas stood at the top, watching. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Douglas smiled. A slow, knowing expression. "I told you," he said softly. "You shouldn't be here." Trevon's grip on the box tightened. His mind raced through possibilities, through every outcome of this moment. He wasn't sure what Douglas was capable of. Not entirely. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just about a fence. It had never been. And now, standing in the belly of the house, surrounded by the remnants of people who had come before him, Trevon knew one thing for certain. He wasn't leaving this place the way he had come in.